Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at something that's constantly in the news, constantly driving policy, the whole narrative around climate science.
Right, and we're doing this based on sources from two academics, very established, longtime professors who are making some, pretty bold claims.
Insiders, really, and their argument is that the field climate science has been seriously compromised.
Yeah, our goal here is to unpack what they're saying. We've got an atmospheric scientist retired from MIT and a physicist retired from Princeton. These aren't newcomers. They're saying financial incentives and politics have fundamentally skewed the research.
And maybe even set back real understanding by, what, 2 generations, they claim?
That's the claim. It's a big one.
Okay, so let's dig into who these guys are. Their backgrounds are key here, right? Because it makes their critique carry a lot of weight. First, Dick Linden, atmospheric sciences, Harvard PhD, then 35 years at MIT.
And Linden's background is interesting. He started out working on problems you could actually, solve.
Yeah.
Things like the quasi-biennial cycle of equatorial winds.
Okay, what's that?
It's this predictable 2-year pattern in the atmosphere near the equator. Winds flip direction. You can model it, understand it. He liked finding those kinds of elegant solutions. That was his world.
Got it. And then the other source is Will Happer, a physics professor from Princeton. Different field lasers, nuclear physics.
Right, and Happer also had this stint in government. He was director of energy research under President Bush Sr. And that experience where science meets federal money seems to be where his skepticism started.
How so?
Well, Happer talks about his time in Washington. He'd bring scientists in from different fields to justify their budgets for the Department of Energy.
Standard procedure, right.
Totally.
Yeah.
And he said almost everyone, physicists, chemists, you name it, they were apparently delighted, is the word he used, delighted to come in, explain their work, talk about why they needed taxpayer funds. But then he met with the climate scientists. And according to him, they were just very resentful about being questioned at all.
Resentful. That sounds odd for scientists discussing funding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And apparently they even told him point blank they didn't really work for the DOE, they worked for Senator Gore.
Wait, seriously? Claiming allegiance to a politician over the agency funding them, that seems like a huge red flag institutionally. How did they think that was okay?
Well, the sources argue it boils down to, money and mission. This political link, they felt, showed a shift. They trace it back to around the first Earth Day, 1970 or so.
Okay.
The environmental movement, which used to focus on maybe more localized issues, things people generally agreed on, like saving the whales or cleaning up rivers,
Yeah.
it pivoted
Pivoted where?
towards the energy sector.
Yeah.
And unlike cleaning a specific river, energy involves, well, trillions of dollars and global control. It became a much bigger game.
Okay, so the money angle is central. And the shift also seems to line up with how the actual crisis narrative changed over time, according to them.
Absolutely. It's kind of wild when you look back. In the mid-70s, the big fear wasn't warming. It was global cooling. An impending ice age was the scare.
And what did they blame that on?
Sulfates from burning coal. The idea was these particles were reflecting sunlight back into space, cooling the planet.
Huh. So, okay, the cooling stopped, warming started later in the 70s, so they needed a new explanation.
Precisely. And the sources point to the work of a scientist named Suki Manabe as being really key for the current focus on CO2. Manabe's early work showed that if you just double CO2 in the atmosphere by itself, you only get about half a degree Celsius of warming.
Half a degree? That doesn't sound like a catastrophe.
Not really, no. But here's the crucial part, the core assumption, according to Linden and Happer. Manabe's model assumed that the relative humidity in the atmosphere stays constant as it warms.
Okay, why does that matter?
Because if relative humidity stays constant, a warmer atmosphere holds more actual water vapor. And water vapor is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2.
Ah, so the water vapor acts like an amplifier.
Exactly. This feedback effect, driven by that assumption of constant relative humidity, basically doubles the calculated warming impact in the model from that half degree up to about 1 degree Celsius.
Wow. So hang on, that whole amplification, turning CO2 from a minor player into a major one in the models, hinges entirely on assuming relative humidity stays constant. Is that assumption like proven fact?
Well, that's the contention. The sources argue that this specific assumption, whether it's right or wrong, is what allowed CO2 to become the main villain, the thing to control. It provided the mechanism needed to justify a huge policy response focused only on CO2.
And they contrast this with the actual history of Earth's climate.
Right. They point out, Earth's temperature has never been static. It goes up, it goes down.
Right.
And CO2 levels have also varied hugely over geological time, long before humans were burning fossil fuels.
They also make a point about CO2 being essential for life, don't they? Not just some pollutant.
Absolutely. They highlight the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age. CO2 levels dropped to about 180 parts per million ppm.
And that was bad.
According to them, it was nearly catastrophic for humans because plants struggled to grow. They say the minimum CO2 for most plant life is around 150, maybe 160 ppm. Below that, basically everything starves.
And where are we now?
Around 400 to 430 ppm. So way above that danger zone.
And they argue the increase from the industrial era hasn't just not been harmful in that sense, but actually beneficial.
Yeah, they claim it's added greatly to the arable land, basically making the earth greener, boosting agriculture. They feel that positive side of CO2 is deliberately ignored.
Which brings us back to the money again. The trillions involved in shifting away from fossil fuels.
It's a staggering amount of money.
And the sources describe this interesting loop, right? How politicians can get campaign funding by steering massive government grants and contracts towards
Companies, researchers, organizations, who then support the policies that keep the money flowing. It becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. Big money influencing policy, policy directing money back to supporters.
And it hits universities directly. How does that work?
This is where it gets really specific and maybe a bit shocking. They claim the biggest driver for universities to push for it. The standard climate narrative isn't necessarily belief or even the research itself, but the overhead charged on grants.
Overhead, like administrative fees.
Exactly, but huge ones. We're talking 50, sometimes 60% of the total grant value.
50 or 60%. Wait, so if a climate scientist gets, say, a $10 million grant?
$5 or $6 million might go directly to the university's central administration. Not to the scientist's lab, not for equipment, not for research assistance. It goes into the university's general funds.
Wow. Okay, so what does that pay for then?
Administrator salaries, new buildings that might have nothing to do with science, maybe propping up other departments. It creates this massive structural financial incentive for the university administration to ensure its scientists bring in those climate grants.
So questioning the narrative that brings in the grants becomes really unpopular internally.
It becomes a potential budget crisis for the university. You can see how that might stifle dissent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which makes you wonder about the whole settled science claim. The sources point out that even the official IPCC reports admit huge uncertainties, don't they?
They do, specifically regarding water vapor and clouds. The IPCC itself says these factors are much bigger climate drivers than CO2, but also that they are not understood at all.
So how can the science be settled if the biggest factors aren't understood? It doesn't add up.
It doesn't. And this, for the sources, is the core abuse of science. Science isn't supposed to be a source of authority like a priesthood. It's a method. It's about challenging, questioning, verifying.
But politicians like the authority aspect.
Well, yeah. They can borrow the reputation of science to claim authority for their policies, even if the underlying science is uncertain or contradicts the policy. The sources argue this fundamentally corrupts the scientific process itself.
This pressure to conform sounds intense. Happer uses an analogy, right? The phlogiston era.
Yes, phlogiston. It was this imaginary substance people believed caused things to burn back in the 17th and 18th centuries. To be a chemist back then, you basically had to talk about phlogiston, even though it didn't exist.
So the analogy is?
The analogy is that today, to get funded, to get published, to have a career in climate science, you often have to frame your work around the prevailing CO2 theory, whether your actual data strongly supports it or not. It's become the necessary belief.
And they give examples of this pressure being applied, real-world barriers.
Oh, yeah. Linden talks about sending a paper that questioned the level of climate worry to the journal Science. He says it was rejected almost immediately, just labeled no interest.
Okay, journals reject papers all the time, though.
True, but then he got it published in a different, maybe less prestigious journal. And the editor of that journal fired immediately after publishing Linden's paper.
Fired, just for publishing a dissenting view.
That's the account. It suggests a pretty extreme level of pressure to enforce conformity.
And there was another instance with a paper he did get published.
Yeah, later he published work on something called the iris effect, basically a negative feedback involving clouds that would reduce warming. It got published, but the journal's new editor then immediately put out a call specifically asking for papers to criticize and refute Linden's findings.
So not just allowing debate, but actively soliciting criticism of one specific paper.
Seems like it. And they also critique the modern peer review system itself. They point out it wasn't really common before World War II, and now it often functions, in their view, mainly to enforce conformity.
They even quote a former editor of Science magazine.
Yes, saying in an op-ed that she basically wouldn't accept articles that question the climate narrative. So the gatekeepers themselves were openly stating they wouldn't allow challenges.
This idea of ideology capturing science, they argue it's not unprecedented. They bring up eugenics.
Right, the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. It's a really chilling parallel they draw.
Why is it relevant here?
Because eugenics wasn't some fringe idea back then. It was mainstream science. It was promoted in leading scientific journals, backed by university presidents, Harvard, Stanford, the big names. It was the scientific consensus.
And that consensus had real-world consequences.
Horrific ones. It led directly to policies like the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 in the U.S. The sources specifically mention this act blocked many Jewish refugees trying to escape Europe before World War II.
So the point is, a strong scientific consensus backed by powerful institutions can still be completely wrong and dangerously so.
That's exactly their warning, that ideology can completely overtake scientific methodology, even with credentialed people involved.
And in the current climate debate, they feel that valid scientific explanations for climate change are being ignored simply because they don't fit the CO2 narrative.
Definitely. The prime example they give is Milankovitch cycles.
Remind me what those are.
They're long-term variations in Earth's orbit. The tilt of its axis, the shape of its orbit around the sun, the wobble. These cycles change the amount of sunlight hitting different parts of the Earth, particularly the Arctic in summer.
And these cycles match the ice age patterns?
They correlate incredibly well with the coming and going of ice ages over hundreds of thousands of years. It's a very strong theory based on orbital mechanics and solar radiation.
But it doesn't involve CO2 as the main driver?
Exactly. So according to the sources, it gets sidelined in the current discussion because the focus is so intensely on CO2 as the only control knob.
They also mention the Isthmus of Panama.
Yeah, the land bridge between North and South America closing up about 3 million years ago. That dramatically changed ocean currents. Think about the Gulf Stream. It likely played a huge role in kicking off the cycle of ice ages we've been in since then.
Another massive geological factor that's not about CO2.
Right. These major natural climate drivers get downplayed or ignored, they argue, because they don't support the current policy focus.
So, bringing it all together, what's the upshot, according to these academics? What's the damage done?
Their assessment is pretty stark. They argue this intense focus on CO2, driven by funding and politics and the suppression of alternative ideas, has set back genuine climate science by at least 2 generations.
2 generations, wow. So decades of research potentially wasted or misdirected.
That's the argument. Time and money spent refining models based on that potentially flawed humidity assumption, instead of grappling with the truly complex, poorly understood factors like clouds and ocean cycles.
And in the public sphere, this translates into what? How does it affect what we hear and see?
Well, they argue the focus shifts to fearmongering, particularly using extreme weather. Why? Because extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, fires, provides powerful visuals. It's emotionally compelling, makes for good TV, and pushes political buttons.
Even if the data doesn't support an actual increase in frequency or intensity.
Right. They claim, for example, that historical data for hurricanes hitting the U.S. shows no significant upward trend, maybe even a decrease in some measures. But the images of destruction are used relentlessly.
They also make a point about the economic predictions, even from official sources.
Yeah, this is interesting. They say even the models used by the UN's IPCC don't actually predict the end of the world. According to the sources, these models project something like a 3% reduction in global GDP by the year 2100 compared to what it would be without climate change.
3% lower GDP in 80 years.
Yeah, as Happer apparently put it, that's maybe disappointing, but it's not the end of the Earth. It's vastly different from the apocalyptic rhetoric we often hear.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? The science itself is just incredibly hard. They mention the Navier-Stokes equations.
Ah, yes. The equations that describe fluid motion, air, water, basically the physics of weather and climate. And the thing is, these equations are famously, fiendishly difficult to solve.
Why is that?
They're highly nonlinear. Think about pouring cream into coffee, the complex swirls and eddies that form instantly, that chaotic mixing. That's nonlinearity in action. Now imagine that on a global scale with the atmosphere and oceans.
So predicting it long-term is basically impossible.
Extremely difficult, bordering on impossible with perfect accuracy. Small changes in initial conditions can lead to wildly different outcomes down the road. That's chaos theory. It fundamentally limits our ability to make precise, long-term climate predictions.
Which really underscores their point about skepticism, doesn't it? If the underlying science is that chaotic and non-predictive, claims of settled science should be treated with caution.
Exactly. It means citizens, you need to really question the certainty being presented, especially when policies with huge consequences are based on it.
And their suggestion for fixing this, for preventing this kind of ideological capture in the future?
They point towards diversifying funding sources. Instead of having one big agency like the Department of Energy dominating funding and potentially being captured by a single narrative, have multiple smaller competing sources. Promote intellectual competition, not conformity.
So it comes back to the structure. The sources lay out this history, this argument that funding structures, political pressures, they can fundamentally undermine the scientific method itself, which relies on challenge and verification.
Right. And if the very mechanisms designed to fund science are instead structurally rewarding conformity and punishing dissent, well, how do you ensure that critical research actually happens? How do you safeguard the methodology?
It leaves us with a pretty challenging thought. If the problem isn't just bad science, but maybe human nature interacting with vulnerable funding systems, how do we institutionalize that old principle, trust but verify, especially for science that shapes our entire world?
A tough question with no easy answers. Something to definitely think about.